there will be a second book, and we can envision maybe eventually a series of books that grow out of the Sioux lecture around themes that are appropriate to the society.
The purpose of this video is to introduce you to Panetics and to the work of the former organization known as the International Society for Panetics.
I think this is an investment. It's not a big investment. We owe David Schwartz a great debt of gratitude because he financed the development of the website. And I really think it ought to be called the David Schwartz website. So thank you, David.
What is Panetics? The aim of Panetics is to help avert or alleviate human suffering, whether inflicted willfully or inadvertently by governments, institutions, professions, or social groups. Panetics takes a pan-ethical approach as applied to research, policy analysis, decision-making, and management. It synthesizes insights from East and West. Panetics is based on these premises. People have a right to be relieved from suffering inflicted by others. The international community has demonstrated a growing willingness to support this right. We lack the awareness, understanding, and tools for decision-making and intervention necessary to be sure such actions will not increase rather than alleviate human suffering. To prevent such missteps, we must search for measures to assess potential and actual human consequences of action, with greater care than we use in economic decision-making. Such Panetic analysis can help leaders, professionals, and managers evaluate the human consequences of their actions. This can lessen the suffering they might otherwise cause, and thus advance human well-being. Panetic principles. The basic principles of Panetics were first proposed by Ralph G.H. Sioux. While there is continuing disagreement, debate, and research about Sioux's precise proposals, Panetics is based on the following principles. Freedom from the infliction of suffering is a human right. The principal focus of Panetics is upon ways to avert or alleviate the infliction of human suffering. Freedom from human suffering, either willingly or inadvertently inflicted by governments, institutions, professions, or social groups, is viewed as a paramount human right, gaining growing acceptance throughout the world community. New tools for analysis and intervention. The second principal focus of Panetics is to develop new tools of analysis that take full account of the humane dimensions of any action. While we have become comparatively proficient in the application of quantitative indicators to economic decisions, we are woefully behind in our development and systematic application of non-economic indicators in making decisions in order to ensure that they alleviate and do not increase human suffering. Whether this requires quantitative measures is a matter of debate within the field. Sioux proposed such a quantitative measure.
The word Panetics is derived by our founder, Ralph Sioux, from the Pali word meaning to inflict. And it was Ralph Sioux's idea to identify who inflicts suffering on whom as a way to eventually alleviate it. He suggested that a unit of measure for the intensity of suffering be called the dukkha, again a Pali word meaning to suffer. And he chose Pali because Ralph thought it's appropriate that we use the language of the Buddha.
The dukkha. The dukkha multiplies the intensity of suffering by the time over which the suffering occurs, by the number of people affected.
Numerous symposia and discussions explore the feasibility of the Panetic approach.
I would like to just start that discussion with a question. In many ways, President Sawyer, I found your remarks in the final stages of your paper rather remarkable, and I'm going to ask you for your perspective on the following question. To date, most of the so-called international humanitarian interventions that have been in small states. When the big states develop a problem, nobody intervenes. And some have argued that this is kind of colonialism in disguise. And yet, I think you quite rightly point out we're all in an international, a world community together now, and the solution to many of these problems it can only be collective. What's your response to this concern that, yes, the big states will intervene in the small states, but when we have a grievance in a state, nothing happens?
I was reading Professor Rossett's book the other day about democracy and peace, and he makes the point that democracies, in his own study over the last half a century or more, democracies do not fight democracies, and I thought there was something profound in this. Not simply that there is a club of people who have the same ideas, but there is an openness about democracies where people find ways to resolve problems other than going to war. There is a predictability because you can turn on the television and you can follow the debate in the British Parliament. You know what issues are at stake and all of this. I say this to say that it may not matter whether a country is big or small. The task of building democracy, I think, is the fundamental task.
The efficacy of such a quantitative approach is a matter of continuing debate and investigation. Through Panetic analysis, we seek answers to such practical questions as, how can we be sure that military or economic humanitarian interventions alleviate rather than increase human suffering? How can we be sure that single-minded interventions in, for example, medicine does not increase rather than decrease suffering? Or, how can we prevent intervention in the name of preserving law and order from producing the very opposite result from that intended?
The International Society for Panetics was founded in 1991 and is based, first of all, I think, on Ralph Siu's concepts, which he put together in 1988, called Panetics, the study of the infliction of suffering, in which he tried to have a quantitative numerical scale to measure the infliction of suffering. And what he wanted to do was to show, for example, that if you add time and number, that a low level of suffering can in fact be cumulatively more damaging than an intense level of suffering. And that, for example, corporate executives who pollute a little bit into a stream which affects millions of people have a larger infliction of dukkha's, or suffering, than someone who might kill somebody when his car runs out of control. And he was trying, in other words, to make suffering and the infliction comparative as a way of identifying things.
The International Society for Panetics honored Dr. Glenn Geelhood, noted surgeon and scholar.
Society would like to present Glenn with the Siu Humanitarian Award in recognition of your remarkable endeavors to reduce the suffering of human beings around the world and your continuing efforts to guide others. And I might add, to inspire the board. We are greatly in your debt, Glenn. Congratulations, Glenn.
Speechlessness. They say that the history of mankind and its future, perhaps, hangs on three little things. Three very little things. One is the fissionable atom. One is the transmissible microbe. And one is the fertilized ovum. And of these three, it seems, each, as the T-34 tank that David Jones spoke of this morning, is mindless. It's an effective and efficient killing machine and doesn't know which side it's on. What it seems is that these three things, at present, at the very least, have not done in humanity, and perhaps because they are possibly under humanitarian control. Doesn't that give hope? And that's what we're going to speak of, hope, and how it's transmissible. Far more transmissible than that virus everyone here knows about is this freely transplantable subject called hope.
Many of the active members of the society were engaged in making the world a better place. One example is Ralph Widener, former president of the International Society for Panetics.
Basically, it is devoting its energy and time to the development of tools that will help decision makers assess the human consequences of their decisions in advance before they make the implement. And there are several kinds of tools that we have the capacity to develop. And if we can organize the young talent that will be necessary to do some of the development work, that would be our greatest contribution to the world. But that's basically what I would like to see it do.
And what's your vision for your own work? Your own work in the world right now?
Well, since I've just finished a 45-year career and I'm retiring, I've been in the business of nation building and region building for 45 years, starting with Pennsylvania when it was going through economic trauma after World War II, and the steel industry was closing and the coal mines were closing and so on. And then they gave me the easy assignment of figuring out what to do with Appalachia, which is a 13-state region of 18 million people, and trying to resolve the problems of that region, some of which are still not completely resolved. So I had the opportunity to organize the development effort for Appalachia. And then they decided, well, you ought to worry about the industrial Midwest and Northeast who are going through economic transformation problems. So then I worked on that. And then they said, well, why don't you look at the whole country? And so I helped the South make the transition from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. And then by this time, many years had run by, they said, well, why don't you go out and help the European Union as it gets organized, and I worked on regions in Europe that were going through economic transformation. And then the Berlin Wall came down, and they said, well, why don't you help Estonia, Latvia, Poland, and now we're helping the former Soviet Union. So that's my vision of what I'm going to do.
Is it possible in the complex world that we're in, given what you have a particular body of knowledge and experience, is it possible for us to really help other nations?
Oh, sure. I wish I could take you home with me, because there's scarcely a day goes by, or at least a week goes by, that people that we've been working with in different parts of the world aren't coming back and saying, now look, here's what we're trying to do with our court system, or here's what we're trying to do with our parliament, or here's what we're trying to do with our tax system, and so on. Can you help us solve the following kinds of problems? And it's not that you take an idea literally from the United States and transfer it to another place. It's the whole attitude of problem solving, which is, most Americans just think, that's a perfectly natural kind of thing to think about. How do you solve a problem? That is not the way most people think in the world. Most people think, I've got a problem, what does Paris want to do about it? Or what does Moscow want to do about it? Or what does Tbilisi want to do about it? And they wait for somebody to tell them what to do. And it's a dependency frame of mind. And the basic spark you're trying to light is the self-initiated, entrepreneurial, creative, problem-solving attitude. And you don't have any idea how difficult that is unless you're working with the young 20 to 30-year-old people in a country. It's very hard for the older people who have been in a system where everything comes down from the top to adjust to that new frame of mind. So we spent a lot of time working with the 20 to 30-year-olds.